Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd, and today I want to analyze the last scene of the third episode of Star Trek Lower Decks, in which they show us the far future, they don't say exactly when, and we see a group of school children being taught about historical figures, namely Ensign Purple Hair from Lower Decks, as well as Chief O'Brien from TNG, who was referred to as the most important person in Starfleet history. And it was supposed to be a joke, but I have some mixed feelings about this joke and I will explain. But first I want to show you something kind of creepy which I didn't even notice on my first viewing of this episode. And that is the fact that all the kids are on their knees when they listen to this teacher. And I guess maybe they just wanted to make it look futuristic, so they wanted to change something. They didn't want it to just look like a school of today. And so first of all it's all outdoors, which is nice. And maybe someone thought that being on your knees is more comfortable than on a chair. Now, if these kids were all aliens, then maybe I can excuse it by saying that's just how the aliens prefer to look, but some of them are obviously humans, and so it doesn't really make sense from a comfort perspective. Maybe they should have had all of them standing, just like, often in Star Trek you see officers standing in their stations, especially in the tactical stations and stuff like that. So maybe that would have made a little bit more sense. Also, we don't know how long these lessons are. Maybe if it's a short lesson it would make sense for them to stand, but being on their knees is kind of strange, and it has a touch of that dystopian feeling, which is what I was complaining about all the recent Star Trek shows, especially in Discovery, but even in the Picard show we see all kinds of things which makes us suspect this is not an utopian future but instead a dystopian one. For example, in the short trek Children of Mars, in which we saw a school on Earth, and it seemed to be a very strict school with Orwellian touches, like you can see the kids in their break, they're sitting in front of a giant screen with all kinds of one-word messages, and so I don't understand why the new Star Trek shows always insert all kinds of little dystopian things into it. Maybe they just think that makes it look futuristic, but it kind of destroys the whole idea of the utopian future, in which humanity became better and more enlightened and everything is nicer and all of that. And so even though we see the school kids are outdoors, which is nice, for some reason they're all kneeling on their knees in front of this teacher, and then all these golden statues appear before them. So this almost, it reminds me of kind of religious worship almost. So I just find it kind of strange, and some people mentioned to me that maybe this is a reference to the movie Serenity, which was the sequel to the series Firefly. And it's been many years since I saw that, so I checked it out, and indeed we have a scene set in a futuristic looking school in which the children are apparently on their knees, but if you look closely they are actually sitting on a tiny chair. And so they're not only on their knees, but it does look similar, so maybe it did inspire this scene, maybe they just wanted to make it look futuristic and they didn't have any idea, and so someone remembered that scene from Serenity, so I do think it's possible. But the school in Serenity also wasn't exactly an enlightened school, as we find out, that they were brainwashed there. And by the way, I also noticed something similar to Star Trek Picard in a scene when the teacher tells them to lie down and go to sleep. We had something similar in that episode when Soji's fake AI mother kept telling her to go to sleep, so it really reminds me of that as well. So maybe someone did watch that movie recently and then took all kinds of ideas into the new Trek shows. So anyway, it's not really a huge deal. I do think they just wanted to make it look futuristic, but it's a little bit disturbing as well. Why are children sitting on their knees all day long in a school? Maybe it was a short lesson. But anyway, then they talk about historical figures, and the teacher shows them a statue of Ensign Purple Hair, and she says he was the most lazy, most corner-cutting officer in Starfleet history, which obviously is the opposite of the truth, because as we saw in this episode, he was the least lazy one. He was the only one who didn't have a problem with doing his duties in the shortest amount of time and all of that, and yet because in the end of the episode he convinced the captain to allow the crew to slack off a little bit in between their assignments, and then she named the protocol after him, and then it shows us the far future in which it is believed that he was the one who was the most lazy because he invented that protocol and all of that. So it's kind of a joke on the fact that history might remember things incorrectly or even the opposite of the truth, which is a funny idea. And it also reminds me of all those scenes in Star Trek First Contact in which Zefram Cochrane turned out to be the opposite of what people thought of him. So everybody thought he's such a big hero, he's such a moral enlightened man that he took humanity to the future and he changed humanity, and it turns out he was actually a drunk who just wanted money. and he just accidentally ended up as being this historical figure, and he even said how he doesn't want to be a statue and all of that. So I do think that scene probably inspired this scene as well, and so that was something really funny in Star Trek First Contact, and so they kind of seem to be recreating the same joke. And then let's get to the O'Brien part. So after she finishes talking about Ensign Purple Hair, she says, let's now move to someone even more important, maybe the most important person in Starfleet history, Chief Miles O'Brien. And he appears together with his transporter console. So I think this joke only works if you saw Star Trek TNG, and probably not if you saw Star Trek Deep Space Nine, because then you would have kind of a different image of that character, because the whole joke here is dependent on how history might remember things completely backwards. And so we know that O'Brien was probably the least important recurring character on Star Trek TNG, because he only appeared once in a while to beam someone out usually. Of course, later on they did have episodes which gave him more to do, but in most of his appearances in TNG, he was just in the background. He's just the transporter guy who beams people over. And so history remembering him as being very important is kind of the same joke as with Ensign Boimler, in which history remembers things incorrectly or the opposite of the truth. But I have some mixed feelings on this joke, because it doesn't really work if you think about it, and especially if you remember Deep Space Nine, in which O'Brien became a main character and not just some minor guy in the background. And so if you look at it that way, this joke doesn't really work. And there were all kinds of memes with these kinds of jokes about O'Brien, because people always joked at the fact that he's always in the transporter room, and that he has nothing to do most of the time, that he only is useful when they need to transport someone. And so what does he do for the rest of the day? And there was that comic book about him that he doesn't do anything all day long. And I remember I even made a TNG edit using the same idea, in which I just showed him standing around in the empty transporter room and getting bored and not doing anything and going crazy. And so that was the joke about him, that he just stands around all day unless someone needs to beam over or if something breaks down. And so in this joke they seem to be relying on people's image of him as just that guy who was in the transporter room all the time. But I think this joke can also be a little bit insulting, because if you know about him from Deep Space Nine, in which he was a main character and he did end up basically saving the galaxy a few times, then this joke doesn't really work, because it's not the opposite of the truth. Actually, he was very important, and so this is not a reversal of the reality, and so the joke no longer works. And even if we just look at his time on the Enterprise, even then I would say that he actually was very important, because there were quite a few episodes in which he saved the life of practically every main character on the show. And maybe only thanks to his amazing transporter skills he was able to do that, because a lot of times he just barely managed to transport someone from an exploding ship and somehow rescued them in the last moment. So maybe he is a miracle worker. Maybe he rescued people in all kinds of situations in which no one else would have been able to do that, because he's just so good with the transporter. And one time he beamed out the assimilated Picard and Worf and Data from an exploding shuttle coming out of the Borg cube, and he just beamed them in the last second, and thanks to this they were able to save the whole Federation, because Data was able to hack into Locutus, and through him to hack into the Borg cube and to save Earth. And so maybe if not for O'Brien, who miraculously beamed them all out, they wouldn't have saved the Federation. And so this is just one example. And of course in Deep Space Nine he saved every main character at some point. And he's also the guy who built the self-replicating cloaked minefield, which saved the whole Federation from the Dominion. And I know that Rom gets most of the credit for that, but if you look at that scene again, you'll see that O'Brien is actually the one who made all of that possible. Of course, Rom was brainstorming with him and Dax, and maybe gave him the initial idea, but O'Brien is actually the one who made it possible. He's the one who actually did the physical work. He's actually the one who designed the mines. He said, I will draw some specs, and then later we see him working on the mines on the Defiant, and so he's the one who actually made the mines. So what if Rom was brainstorming with him? O'Brien is actually the one who made it possible. And again, they only barely did it in the last second. So I think maybe if not for O'Brien, they wouldn't have been able to prevent Dominion reinforcements from arriving from the Gamma Quadrant, and then the Federation would have been conquered or maybe even genocided. And even later during the Dominion War itself, he was involved in some key moments which might have saved the battle. For example, during the invasion of Chintoka, he's the one who did some technobubble to allow them to get through those defense systems, which they were unable to defeat, and only thanks to O'Brien, who somehow fooled that system into shooting on its own power source. Only that way the invasion was successful. So maybe if not for that, also they wouldn't have won the war. And I have many more examples from Deep Space Nine that if not for him, the whole situation would have been lost and maybe the whole galaxy would have been doomed, if not for his involvement. And in one episode he saved the prophets in the wormhole from a power wraith who wanted to kill all of them and possessed his wife Keiko, and yet he was able to defeat that power wraith and save the prophets, and the prophets we know are basically gods to the Bajorans. And also the prophets are the ones who stopped the Dominion fleet in the end after the Dominion destroyed the minefield. The prophets themselves stopped it, but if O'Brien hadn't saved the prophets, then that also wouldn't have happened. And God knows what the Paraiths would do without the prophets keeping them in check. Maybe they would be like demons and taking over the whole galaxy. And so O'Brien was a key player in so many different episodes, and without him the whole galaxy might have been lost. And also we know that in the end of the show he went back to Earth and he became a teacher at Starfleet Academy, so maybe he became a great teacher who inspired a lot of future Starfleet officers who also saved the galaxy, so maybe he had all kinds of wisdom that he shared with so many other people in Starfleet Academy that also helped save the galaxy numerous times. And so I think anyone who watched Deep Space Nine wouldn't really agree with this joke, because O'Brien was actually a very important person if we saw Deep Space Nine, and even in TNG itself, and so that's why I'm not sure this joke really works that well. It would only work as a joke if you think of O'Brien as that guy who was always in the transporter room and not really doing that much, and yet history remembers things incorrectly, and maybe the opposite of the truth, but it's not the case with O'Brien that we actually saw. They actually got it right about O'Brien. Maybe they got it wrong about Ensign Boimler, thinking that he was lazy and cat-corning when actually it was the opposite of the truth, but about O'Brien maybe they actually got it right. And also, as I said, this scene reminds me of that whole idea in Star Trek First Contact, when Cochrane didn't want to have a statue of himself, and he didn't like the fact that everybody looked at him as such an amazing hero and historical figure, maybe because he was ashamed because he knew that he is not that person, at least not yet. That he's actually just a guy who wants money and wants to drink alcohol and be with naked women all day, as he said. Cochrane simply became that historical figure later. Maybe after he met the Vulcans, it also had a profound influence on him as well, not just the rest of humanity. And the event itself was so big and so important that it reflected back on everybody involved. And so because Cochrane was the one who made all of that possible, then all the good things that came from it were kind of personified about him. So because he's the one who made the First Contact, and the First Contact was such an amazing event for humanity, that Cochrane himself got a lot of the glory. And it kind of reminds me of what happened with Gene Roddenberry himself, who by the way was also kind of referenced in this scene in Lower Decks, in which they mentioned the Great Bird of the Galaxy, which was one of the nicknames for Gene Roddenberry. And just recently I heard another YouTuber kind of bashing Gene Roddenberry, saying that his vision was just money. He didn't really have an enlightened vision of humanity, and he was a nasty human being, and this and that. And that kind of annoyed me, honestly, but there are some points to it, meaning that Gene was far from perfect human being. And some people would even say he's a hypocrite because, for example, he said he doesn't want any smoking in Star Trek, and yet he was a smoker in real life. And some people say he just wanted a successful show, he just wanted to make money, and he didn't really care about all of that. I tend to disagree because I watched a lot of interviews of him, and I do think he cared about the ideas he put into the show. He did believe in all of those ideas, he did want to promote his ideas into the show, and a lot of his ideas were good ones. Not all of them, I don't agree with everything he ever did and said, but overall I think most of his influence was very positive, and of course a lot of other people also contributed a lot of good ideas and made them better, and maybe filtered out some of the bad ideas by Gene. And so I think we have kind of a similar situation as with Cochrane, because a lot of times people, including myself, would say the vision of Gene Roddenberry when referring to certain ideas of what Star Trek should be, and so people say that's the vision of Gene Roddenberry, but in reality a lot of the good ideas came from other people. In the case of TNG, I think Michael Piller added a lot of those good elements that I loved in TNG, and of course a lot of people made it all work, And so it wasn't all just from Gene Roddenberry, and some of the silliest ideas came from him, some of the stupid ideas came from him, some of the limitations were because of him, and after he was gone, maybe it freed the show a little bit and made it more interesting. And so we have that image of him as that guy who personifies all the positive things about the show and none of the negatives. But of course, it's a slightly skewed idea. But I don't mind that so much because I do think he did contribute a lot of positivity, much more positive than negative, I would say, and the whole idea, the basic ideas of it, and he got it all started basically. And so I don't really mind that he gets even more credit than he deserved. And so it's okay to criticize him for all the bad things, but no one can really deny that he was a big part of what started all of it, and the big chunk of the best ideas did come from him. In my opinion, some people might simply disagree what the show should be about, how it should be done, that it should be an enlightened future and all of that. And I personally do think that he was the one behind many of those ideas, and even Rick Berman later, he often said that he tried to do the shows the way that Gene would have wanted them to be, and so that's why he insisted on keeping a lot of those elements. And in retrospect, I think that was a wise decision. Not always. Some of the limitations he put on the shows, especially on Deep Space Nine, which maybe would have been better if not for those limitations. So I have some mixed feelings on that. It's not a black and white issue, but for the most part, Rick Berman, who was a friend of Gene, tried to keep that vision alive and prevented anyone from destroying that. And so even though it wasn't Gene Roddenberry himself doing that, it was Rick Berman kind of trying to keep his legacy, but we can still kind of attribute it to Gene. So Gene is still responsible even if he wasn't alive during that time. It was Rick Berman carrying on his legacy. And so I think when people, including myself, who talk about the vision of Gene Roddenberry, we don't necessarily mean the man himself. We kind of just refer to that vision which a lot of people contributed to, including Michael Piller is probably the best example. Based on all the behind-scene stuff I saw about him, I really liked him. I thought he added so much of the good stuff into TNG. But when I talk about the vision of Star Trek, I cannot list all the names, and so it's simply easier for me, and probably for others, to simply say that's the vision of Gene Roddenberry, and then just move on. So it's kind of easy to personify it and put it all linked to one name, to one person, and then it's simply easier to remember, and it's easier to understand what you're talking about. And so that's, I think, kind of the effect that happens historically when you kind of glorify certain people in history, maybe more than they deserve, simply because it's easier that way. So you wouldn't list a whole bunch of group of people who all contributed something. Instead, you just put it all on one guy who started it. All of this also reminds me of something I talked about recently about a different YouTuber who was saying that Lily didn't get the credit she deserved in First Contact because she helped build the warp ship, and yet Cochrane got all the credit. And that might have been an interesting topic to explore in the actual movie, but the movie never really said that she's the one who helped invent the warp drive itself. That was all Cochrane based on what we know. And so I don't think there was any historical injustice, but that could have been an interesting element to add to that movie as well. And I don't really mind if people speculate about that. I just don't want them to say that as a fact when we don't have any evidence of that. But that is kind of an interesting idea to explore, that maybe Cochrane wasn't really the only person involved in that project, but he's the one who got all the glory because he was simply the pilot in the end. He's the one who met the Vulcans, and so all the glory is on him, and people tend to over-glorify him in history, and he's like the most enlightened person ever and the most important person in history who started the whole idea of Starfleet and the Federation. But actually all he did was a handshake with a Vulcan, and he danced with that Vulcan after he was drunk, after he did that warp jump. And maybe other people helped him build the actual ship. And so that's kind of funny how we look at history. And so that's why I kind of like this scene in Lower Decks in which they're poking fun at all of this, how history remembers things incorrectly. And in the case of Miles O'Brien, the whole joke depends on the fact that he really wasn't that important, and yet history remembers him as being important. But I say we actually can look at this scene seriously and say that maybe O'Brien really was important. And we don't really know what else he did after Deep Space Nine. Maybe he went on to do even greater things, and so we don't really know. And so that's why I think we can actually look at this scene seriously and not as a mockery of it. But the intention, I think, was just to have a joke, and that's why it falls a little bit flat in my opinion, because it all depends on him being not important, and history remembers him as being important, but he actually was important, and so that's kind of a double twist on it. So anyway, that's my thoughts on that whole scene in the end of the third episode of the show. And if you agree or disagree with any point I made, you can let me know in the comment section and we can continue the discussion there. And I will see you all next time. Bye bye.